Have you ever wondered what the Cultural Revolution felt like? This interview is with Fred Engst, a Maoist theoretician and somebody supportive of revolutions worldwide who was a participant in the Cultural Revolution. And in this interview, he shares his experiences in participating in worker struggles, talking to the masses, students, and peasants, and sharing many funny details about his life, like the difference of working in the US versus China. Hope you enjoy this video. Basically, we wanted to talk about a couple of different things, some of your personal experiences growing up in China at the time, the Cultural Revolution, but then also some general assessments, kind of looking back and having done a lot more practical and theoretical work, and then some more specific questions, really, especially about the latter half of the Cultural Revolution. But then we could go ahead and start with the first question. Could you give us an overview growing up in China during the socialist period?
I've been talking about that quite a bit to people in the US ever since I came to the US. I came in the US 74, and we had US-China People's Friendship Association. And so I had the opportunity to go twice, once with my father in 75, once with my mother in 77, go around the country talking to all kinds of people about our experience, not just my own, but my family and everything. That gave me some understanding what kind of questions people in the US are interested. But then in the 80s and 90s, and I was really in ideological crisis because what I witnessed, what I experienced is being demonized. Maoist socialism was demonized, and the Cultural Revolution was demonized, not only in the US, but in China, I mean, of all places. So what is the way out? I was really very confused. But I think that after many years observing what happened in China and what happened in the US, and finally, I think my experience in China is being validated. And so now I have a better understanding not only what happened, but why it happened. But my parents came to China in the late 40s. My father went to China in 46. My mother went to China in 48. Of course, you know, my mother was originally a nuclear physicist, participating in the Manhattan Project. First, she went lobbying for civilian control of nuclear energy, see what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then after 2 years in graduate school, find out her scholarship came from the Navy. That was devastating. That was the final straw. I just couldn't take anymore. And so she quit, and she knew my father, and so she went to China. And also at that time, my uncle, my mother's brother, in China. So they moved to China and got married and had a family. And so I was raised on a state farm, and didn't know anything better or different or anything. I think we all become aware of society in middle school. I mean, as in the middle school, you can see today is the middle school students, high school students walk out of the classroom, join the protest, right? It's like that's the age they start feel aware of what's going on. So just when I was in middle school, the first year, my 7th grade, the Cultural Revolution broke out. And that's the defining moment for my life. And that was enormous, a tremendous experience, even though I'm just a 7th grader and didn't know too much. But you observe people, what they talk about it, what they get excited about it, what they fight over about it. And right before the Cultural Revolution began, our family moved from Xi'an to Beijing. And I wasn't too ready to move to Beijing. And so I came about a half year later. And when I went to Beijing, it's all occupied by Red Guards from all over the country. I mean, Beijing was just incredible. All the schools, there's no classes, and the classroom is opened up, putting straws as beds for the visitors around the country. All the university, well, not too many universities in those days, but high schools, middle school, any kind of school, classroom. So you have place to put straws as a bed. And my parents' office, my mother's office, turned into receptions for Red Guards. So on the street, you see people from around the country. In those days, very few people go to college. College is very elite. So most Red Guards are middle school students like me and some high school. Well, city folks, just about everybody able to have middle school education. Of those, I'm guessing around 1966, maybe 20, 30% able to go to high school. Of the high school graduates, maybe 5 to 10% can go to college. So college is very elite. So the Red Guard movement predominantly is middle school students. In their 16 years old, 17 years old, and they leave their city and come to Beijing. The people from Beijing go to around Shanghai, Wuhan, going all over the place. And it's such a massive movement. And for people to exchange experiences and ideologies, debates, and so everybody able to write big character posters and read or distribute. So in those days, you write a big character poster, and the government provides free paper, ink, and glue. So you find a wall, any wall that you can post on, and people just write it. And most people write stuff about their local issues, their school, their factory, their neighborhood, their city. Just like when we have social media today, people have heated debates, arguments, very intense. For example, in the factory, some workers will be have some gripes about the management, some particular person, and he will write a picture poster, denounce that person as capitalist, rotist, revisionist, and anti-party, anti-socialist, whatever. And others don't feel the same way. They have a big hair poster, post right on top of you, block you, and people get in arguments. Okay, people need to learn how to argue civilly. They don't born with that. No kids when they fight. Okay, so people argue very intensively, and a lot of debates, and sometimes getting escalated to violence. There were a lot of violence happening. So you can see a lot of things can be quite chaotic. And so in my experience in the Cultural Revolution, especially the first year, in retrospect, from what I know, is the deepest, longest, most thoroughgoing, and most sophisticated movement for the working class to know, learn how to be master society. You have people have different views, different ideas, and how do you resolve those? And how do you know who is a good leader, who is a bad leader? And we always have a democracy. When you have democracy, when a minority not only disobey the majority's view, what do you do? So I was fortunate to travel with my cousin, Bill Hinton's daughter, and they have a group of people went to a coal mining town west of Beijing, maybe a few hundred miles in Shanxi province, the place called Yangquan. And as all the Red Guards are mostly students, these are middle school and high school and some even college students. So I experienced that coal mining town for about 3-4 months. And I just remember some incidents. The students, they write big charter posters. They have rallies supporting the underdog, these rebels who are underdog, and that they will have meetings and all kinds. I participate in those, but I was the youngest one of the whole group. And I barely can make heads and tails about what's going on. But I remember one day we working in the mines. Well, that was another whole experience. You have to put this helmet with the lights on, a brain and back with a battery, backpack, and then you put your mask on, you go with the rail car, and you go underneath the deep mine. And so you go, what they do, they drill holes in the coal, and they put dynamite there, and then everybody leaves, and then I said, fire! And then you go in there, you shovel the coal into a conveyor belt. And so one day we're doing the work, one guy, a worker, so angry, came to our places. God damn it, those conservatives, they're real reactionaries. They burned the national flag. If that's not a counter-revolutionary, tell me what it is. So we get all agitated. No, these are real counter-revolutionaries. We got to do something about that. And so after work, we rush into the coal mine administrative building. And that's about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening. Hundreds of people arguing, debating. I go around, what happened? What happened? Well, that conservative faction stepped on our rebel flag. We are revolutionaries. They step on our flag. That is counter-revolution. So you can see the fighting going on. And I learned my lesson. Don't believe that what you hear first. You got to find out a different side of stories. Oh, all kinds of fascinating stories, all kinds. By January 67, started with the Shanghai workers who took over the city administration. They didn't really storm into the city government. The city government threw up their hands, says, we can't do anything. And the workers says, well, get out of the way. We take over, all right? Mao said that is a seizing the power. And so encouraged people around the country to do seizing the power. And so I witnessed the people in coal mining, rebels, seize the power of the coal mine. And there were a lot of struggle, but by then, the Central Committee figured out the students start playing more of a negative role than a positive role. Because you're an outsider, how can you be one that in charge of what's going on? I mean, you got to let the workers themselves to decide what's right and wrong. You can be as advisory role, but the students not very happy being the advisory role. They tend to want to call the shots. So the Central Committee have a call for all the students to go back to their school and make revolution in their school rather than telling other people what to do. Well, that's the nature of a student. I mean, they're very spirited and they're full of energy and they are naturally sympathetic to the underdog because they grew up as underdog, right? So having the students around the country fan up the flame of Cultural Revolution, supporting the minority group, the rebels, to rebel against their local authorities, they played a tremendous role. It's a critical. Without these Red Guards, you won't have a Cultural Revolution, and just amazing. But that's another whole story. How Mao discovered Red Guards. He's not an inventor. He's from the masses to the masses. So he observes and see what's going on and then find what it has potential. And so he found the Red Guard has great potential and it proven to be right. Red Guards were asked to go back home and do the revolution in their own schools. And so we all given free ticket to go back to Beijing. But I was not satisfied. I said, well, I don't want to just go back to Beijing. I have so much fun. I don't want to just take a train ride and go home. So I convinced my cousin and 2 other college students. We just took the train ride halfway on a town that's about 100 miles. It took us a whole week to walk back to Beijing. That was an incredible experience. Like you walk in the countryside, every town, every village, every city that you go through, you go there. So where's the reception place for Red Guards? They point to it. You go there and they tell you, okay, you can stay in this place, this school, that farmhouse, that barn or whatever. When I went back to Beijing, it's so anticlimactic. Just like all the fun's over. And then we went to the school I was supposed to go to, restored classroom activity by the fall of 67. But we mostly doing reviewing what we learned the first year. So my 9th year of middle school, I did most of the time reviewing the 7th grade material. So when I came to US, and people in Philadelphia joke with me, says, what's Fred and Rizzo, the police chief, become mayor in Philadelphia, what they have in common? Both had only 7th grade education. Totally uneducated in that sense, but I had a great education. That education about the Cultural Revolution, you cannot learn from the book. You observe the spirit of people, the enthusiasm, and the conflict is sometimes can be escalated very bad outcomes. And there are a lot of those stories. So in the Western press, a lot of these sour stories about the Cultural Revolution by the intellectuals, they complain a lot of these infighting, but they didn't really tell you if people are able to speak up, what would happen if they disagree? Your democracy is under law and order, so you don't allow people to challenge the private ownership means production. But if you allow people in the US to challenge General Motor workers, Ford Motor workers can challenge management, not just about union related, but who should be in the management. Imagine what would happen. Oh my God. So there are a lot of stories of that period. One great achievement of Mao's period is to make the whole population literate. So history is no longer written by the ruling class alone. History is written by the people. So you can censor, you can stifle, you can do whatever you want. But underground, among the masses, there are so many historical material. Their diaries, their memoirs, all kinds of stuff, letters. Yeah, vast. It's vast. Even though maybe 99% is being destroyed, a population of 600 million, 1%, still a large number. So it's incredible. There are a lot of stuff in there and really worth going into it. And so anyway, my own story is that my parents got moved to the city. They're not happy about it. And then early 70s, they went back to a state farm near Beijing. And also I was exposed to all the visitors came to China in 1971. My cousins and my grandmother took youth delegations of friends and relatives. So I got exposed so much about the US. And then my cousin came to the US in 71. And I was just so fascinated about what's going on in the US. So with an incredible curiosity, I decided I want to come to the US. So I came in 74 and I stayed 30 some years in Philadelphia and they moved. That move from China to US is big enough. And I just beginning working my uncle's farm for 6 months, roughly. Then I got a job in the city in the 75. And then I got laid off 8 weeks later and just like skies falling. God, what experience learning the freedom. This is a free country and you can free to find any work and the boss can freely fire you or lay you off. And the freedom is a double-edged sword. And when I got laid off, I remember so clearly that day, a Friday afternoon, the boss comes around. Next week, you don't have to come here. I said, what? What happened? We don't need you. What about me? Well, that's not your problem. So on my way home, I drive this old beat up car, about $100 I bought from my cousin. What am I do about my rent? What am I do about my food? What if I get sick? What if, my God, the sky's falling? Just worst experience. And I really appreciate what's called a freedom, freedom to get fired. The contrast of working in China and then my experience of working in the US, just night and day. By the time I finished my 9th grade, me and all my classmates were assigned jobs. Some went to the army, some went to the Northeast, some went to other provinces. I was so eager to go to a poor farming community in North Shanxi, but the school assigned me a job with another 20 of my classmates to a woodworking factory. So I worked there for 5 years. So you can say I didn't have a freedom to choose the job I want, okay? But just imagine the freedom to find your jobs is double-edged. So you want to be able to do anything you want. And then the factory, the farm has to unconditionally hire you. They might not want to do that, okay? So there's no unconditional freedom in that sense. And so I went to the plywood factory. It was a great experience, great experience. How good that experience is, I only felt after working in the US. When I went back to China the first time in 77, I spent 4 months in China. I spent 3 months, went back to that factory, going the same routine with my buddies. and enjoyed every minute of it. 80s, I went back, 90s, I went back, things changed dramatically. And more, I'm telling the contrast of my experience working in the US, working in China, start making sense to them. I'm just saying that in US, even though the living standards are very high, but you're wage labor, you're a wage slave in the sense that you have to please the foreman, please the capitalist, please the boss. If they're not happy with you, they can fire you, they can lay you off. And so you don't have the job security and everything. In the US, we talk about pecking orders. If you work in a factory or work in an institution, some kind of office or some company, there's a pecking order. I remember working in the Bud Company in Philadelphia. I mean, you walk in the plant, you know this is their territory. And in fact, some foreman told me another job that says, we don't practice democracy here. You want democracy, you get out the factory gate. We hire you for your muscle, not for your brain. We do the management, all right? Don't try to tell us how to run this place. So you know your position, okay? Your position, just a hire labor. You do what is told, all right? You have no right to tell the management what to do. Does not experience working in China during Mao's period, not at all. When I was working in the factory, I don't remember a single incident where I was afraid of somebody in the leadership. I mean, what I remember, some people, factory managers, people in a higher level administrator, walk into our shop, the old workers or sarcastically says, wow, long time no see. I'm happy you're coming here. Actually means that you are divorced from masses. You're so hard to see, okay? Sarcastic. Under Mao's period, the workers have a so-called, in Chinese, they call it iron rice bowl. You cannot be fired. There's no bonus to be deducted. So the workers have a security. With that security, they can talk back. They really can talk back. And in the US, I don't remember anybody talking back other than a strike by the union members if you have a union, okay? If you don't have a union, you don't talk back. So such great contrast. So I just noticed when I first went back to China, all they know is you make so much money. And then later on, they find out after reform started, they had bonuses, and the bonuses first 5 yuan, 10 yuan, and more bonuses. But they find out who should get a bonus. It's not what workers think who does the best job, but it's based on the management. Whoever kiss ass, who gets the bonus. And the little bonus that you get cannot compare to the bonus that 5, 10 times, 100 times the factory manager gets. So basically, even though early in the 80s, workers don't get fired easily, with inflation, you depend on the bonus. So a lot of workers just resign. Says, well, okay, it's not, you don't get bonus based on your ability to work, but rather based on your ability to kiss ass. And so they just slow down. They start just, well, I got my basic pay. I'm not ambitious. I don't want to kiss ass. Just slow down. It's not an overt strike, but just not working. Okay. And so that's why the China in the late 80s, they push and they says, we got to break the iron rice bowl. So they make everybody a contract labor, and then the manager can fire you and discipline you at will. And that's been like that and more. Today, just totally, everybody's a temp worker. Everybody's a temp worker. And you don't have any rights anymore. Well, standard of living's going up because you have a tremendous difference in labor productivity. So look, in the farm where my uncle works, he has 160 some acres of land. He was able to farm all by himself. And he produced tons and tons of corn. That's equivalent to a whole village in China. So how can you have the same living standards? enormous difference in labor productivity. All right. So today, the same thing. Chinese workers' standard of living wise is so much different. It's very common to have a apartment for people in the city. In the countryside, they can build their own houses, and the labor productivity is increased. Today, it's only 5 to 10% of labor engaged in agriculture. So you have construction sites, you have all these modern equipments. So each worker can produce a lot of stuff. Consequently, all the stuff produced, you have to sell someone. You cannot just always dump in the ocean, and you cannot just export overseas. It has to be consumed by people in China, the majority of it. How they consume? The wages has to compensate. Otherwise, you have crisis over production. Okay? The crisis over production. You cannot keep on producing without people consuming it. So wages gone up, but working class, the pecking order is in the very bottom. So that's a big contrast.
I'm curious on a few different things you said, but I guess one of them you were emphasizing that, and I've heard you mention this before elsewhere, that really in the 80s and 90s, then people were able to really understand a little more of what capitalist practices were, having seen them, and to get a better sense also of what the conditions for workers in America was or are, given that the kind of high level of wages don't mean much when you have the freedom to be fired at any moment. And also when, especially we see, and I know it's similar today in China, the massive amount of debt people end up in, which means that you have some more use value, some more goods, but you're barely able to keep up with just holding on to paying for those things and so on, which is a very typical situation for the working class. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, just like the growing consciousness in the 80s and 90s of China of what the reforms really were and how they represented a shift towards capitalism.
The mass movement at the end of the 80s is a reflection of that. The people at that time believed they are the masters, but they thought they were master of society, and they were proven wrong. There are a lot of similarities in history in that way. There's a Chinese phrase that elbows cannot fight legs. The leg is a lot stronger than your elbow, okay? So you can't arm wrestle with somebody's leg, not the same league, okay? Not in the same league. But so people resign to just enjoy their life in capitalism. Part of the reason that today people keep on complaining Mao's period, people standard of living is low and everything, but they forget a very basic fact that in Mao's period, the drive is to do a rapid industrialization. And what the rapid industrialization entail is to have high rate of accumulation, a low rate of consumption, and the consumption improves slowly, but not that drastically. So the emphasis is put into a heavy industry. You won't have anything tangible for people to consume for a long time. So for example, for people to have clothes to wear, they got to have a textile mill. To have a textile mill, they got to have machinery that makes textile machinery. To have a machinery that make textile, you got to have a steel industry. To have a steel industry, you have to have coal mine. So for mining coal, mining steel, to make machine, to make the textile machine, to make textile, to make clothes, that's few years. So invest in heavy industry, you won't see anything for many, many years. How do you do rapid industrialization? So you have to make sure the workers got enough to eat, enough to clothes, but not too much. And the peasants has to contribute enormously to this industrialization, especially the people in the farm who are doing well, basically have this unequal value exchange between farm product, industrial product. And so the places that are doing well in the countryside, they contribute greatly to the industrialization. And so after the reform in the late 70s and 80s, they stopped industrialization. They pretty much stopped. So they put emphasis on light industry, on consumer goods. So the market is full of meat and chicken and vegetables and fruit for the people who have money. So it looks like a lot of prosperity. But if you look in the overall statistic, what you find is Chinese industrialization pretty much stalemated 80s and 90s. Only really restored after China joined WTO. It's a rapid growth only starting in 2000. people always say, since the reform, China's economy grow rapidly. That's straight a lie. There's no data, no government official data to support it. I go to a Chinese government website, Statistical Bureau, and only thing that they show the growth rate faster since 80s compared to Mao's period is GDP. But GDP, there's no gathering of data about GDP in Mao's period. All the GDP data is estimated based on a formula they use. So they can use anything they want to do that. And so when I use some real things, energy output, grain output, light industry, or most important, using the growth rate of electricity. Electricity is one measure of industrialization that's uniform in quality. I mean, 1949, 1 kilowatt of electricity is identical to today's 1 kilowatt of electricity. Based on electricity, the growth rate of electricity output usage is 50% faster, higher than post-Mao's period. We have hard evidence. And besides, you have anecdotal evidence. All the high-tech industry that was started in the Cultural Revolution is stopped. I mean, China was just only a few years behind in semiconductors in the 70s. Now they're almost 50 years behind. They're trying to catch up. Chinese industrialization just pretty much stopped, dead on the track in the 80s, 90s, and only pick up later. Living standards changed, but that's the natural outcome of increase in labor productivity. I mean, how can you have a farmer in the US, like my uncle who grow corn, to have the same standard of living as people in the Chinese village who produce 1/100th of the output?
I'm going to say a few things for those who will be watching this who aren't as familiar with political economy. Heavy industry refers to the sectors of the economy that produce means of production. And light industry is a sector of the economy that produces means of consumption. So in order to produce means of consumption, clothes, food, etc., you need to first have the machinery, like you were saying, to produce the clothes and food and so on. And so China's situation post-1949 necessitated a large amount of the surplus that was produced socially above and beyond what was needed to reproduce the society, to be invested in expanding production, principally in the heavy industry. And that was necessary to eventually raise the standard of living. But that takes time. As you said, it's not simple. Just to reiterate it and just break it down a little bit, as I don't know how familiar everyone's going to be with some of the political economy.
Yeah, and also China today is the most industrial output in the world. European countries together might be more than China, but they're comparable. But as a country, China is number one. Where did that came about? That came from Mao's period, that rapid industrialization. Some people are saying the Chinese model, why can't other third world countries emulate? Why can't India, Brazil, and other large third world countries emulate? They cannot, because they did not really overthrow imperialism. Mao's period, they had indigenous sovereign economic development, delinked from the world market. They forced to do themselves, and rapid industrialization manifest in that for a long time, the living standards did not improve much. And we know that. When I grew up, we know that. We tighten our belt. We cannot eat to our full. We tighten our belt. We want to build a strong China. That was the common understanding. We sacrifice now so we have a better future. Whole generations that understood that's what we want to do. And we want to rapid industrialization to get rid of poverty, get rid of backward in not only in terms of technology, medicine, education, all that. Oh, another very interesting statistics. 1969, when I went to the factory, is the year that high school graduates skyrocket. You can see slow improvement in the number of high school graduates. And then 69, just a skyrocket to 79, nosedive. So Mao's period, especially the 10 years of Cultural Revolution, it is the most impressive advances in technology, in science, in education, in farm mechanization. It's an incredible change. It's all stopped in the screechy howl in the 80s and 90s. These are Chinese facts. I mean, they're published the government official press just talks nonsense. The data doesn't back up what they claim, but nobody can challenge it. So yeah.
No, all of that is incredibly helpful, and I'm excited to talk a bit more about some of those reasons why those advances didn't continue with the ultimate defeat of the Cultural Revolution, knowing the enormous repercussions that it still has today. I mean, even with some of the ongoing revolutionary movements, of course, we can picture a very different world as if China would still be on the socialist road in terms of technological advances, that they were not just on the brink because so many advancements had already been made, but with that foundation really laid, the infrastructure really laid in terms of industry. So I'm very excited to talk about that, but I want to ask one more question before we really get into more of the latter half of the Cultural Revolution. You mentioned that there were lots of, and I've read that there's lots of discussions in the early years of the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards, long train rides spent together with lots of excited discussion. And I think something that we see is that there's this blend of, on the one hand, these very deep theoretical discussions on capitalist rotors, the difference between Mao's line and Liu Shaoqi's line, and at the same time, a lot of factionalism that wasn't really based on any political differences, and sometimes were clash of personalities or some mode of intrigue that led to higher ranks within the party. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more, but what were some of those conversations and discussions like that you heard? Because if I think of middle schoolers having political discussions, I'm sure it was a big mix of the two. So if you could tell us a bit more about the nature of some of these conversations and maybe the way some of those things blended, I'd be very curious to hear about that.
It's hard. Well, because a lot of time the arguments tend to clothe in rhetorics and does not really reflect people's real thinking. And just like in the history, religious wars fought over gospel teachings. So you have to really careful to evaluate what people said, what the true meaning, what the class interest it really represents. People consciously or subconsciously disguise their real intentions. And even among the masses, at one extreme, you will have some of the workers who are not very enthusiastic about building socialism, more care about their own family or their own well-beings, and being mad with the managers, often criticizing for doing a sloppy job, and that they can use the Cultural Revolution as a time to vent their grievances, clothing in their revolutionary slogans. And you are a capitalist rotors, you're oppressing us, and all that stuff. Working class does not naturally born know how to be the lead ruling class in the society. It's through the massive movement you filter through and you find out, okay, what is the essence their complaint is about. What you find is that majority, the complaint, the criticism is that the leadership in school or in the factory or any institutions, they very much divorced from masses. They treat themselves as masters, and they treat the workers, the students, as a second class or not as worthy as them. So the people in leadership not treating the other people as equals. What working class need to is to took over this socialized production. But for socialized production, especially you have long chains from mining to machine building, all kinds of things. You have to have a long network of coordination. And so you do need some people specialized in coordinating thousands, millions workers' labor. So working class delegate some people to do this kind of work, but once you delegate, doesn't mean you are superior to the people who trust you to be the coordinators. So the example I use is like we go on buses. We cannot have steering wheel on every person's seat. We have one steering wheel for everybody. So the person driving, we entrust the person to steering the wheel, And if he or she not doing a good job, it says, get out, let somebody else do it. And if everybody in the bus knows how to drive, then that person does not have a monopoly of this ability to organize production, so to speak. But if you have only one person in the bus allowed to know how to drive, that person become a rulers of everything. So how to, one hand, make everybody more or less know something about organizing production so that that skill is not monopolized by a few, and also make those people who are in charge and coordinating production, coordinating office work, coordinating school administration, see themselves as servants rather than masters. So that is the issue. And so the Cultural Revolution people argue, the fact they can argue means they're not treated as servants. So they want to make sure the people in charge of production process, in charge of the companies, school administrations, treat people as equals. And so a lot of times the complaints, some are legitimate, some are not. So you can imagine people in office, people in a leadership position, they feel they work very hard, they work long hours, and yet all these grumpy people criticize me. They cannot be totally objective. I mean, we know when you do a program, somebody criticizes how you do it, and you can be defensive, okay? And sometimes I do something, people criticize me, I can be defensive. So how to criticize, discuss without putting other side as enemies, as attacked, and you need to learn it, because class society, thousands of years of class society, is always competing to be the top dog. I mean, working class in power is not to among the worker himself, everybody's trying to be the top dog. That is reproducing the class society. That was the kind of debate among the Red Guards. At the beginning, they criticizing the leadership. And when the leadership suppressed them, then they're revolutioning, they're rebelling. But once that suppression is over, you took over the school, you took over the factory. How do you run? When you have different opinion, how do you treat other people in the school, in the factory, in the office, who have different opinion with you? How do you correctly handle the contradictions among the people? That's the same old problem Mao wrote in 57. Correct handling the contradiction among the people. Easier said than done. So you have to distinguish between two different types of conflicts. Those are conflicts with different aims. Some want socialism, some want capitalism. We have different aims. And then there are different conflicts that we have same aim, but we have different means to achieve those goals. That's what we call line struggle. So you have struggle over road, socialist road or capitalist road. That's struggle over aims. Then you have struggle over how to achieve socialism. That's a line struggle about the means to achieve that. And so, of course, during the Cultural Revolution, we call it bourgeois reactionary line. In retrospect, that is not quite correct to phrase that, but that's history. I mean, that's how we understand things step by step, because in the history of the struggle within the working class, within the communist movement, there's always two-line struggle. Some are two-line struggles, some are struggle against revisionism. It's not about lines, because revisionism is not a different means to achieve the same goal. They have a different goal. And of course, they don't say they have different goals. It doesn't say, oh, we're not really for socialism. They don't do that. I think in retrospect, the difficulty is to distinguish between the people who have different aims versus the people who have different means about what's right and what's wrong. And that's the difficulty in distinguish between the contradiction among the people or the contradiction between people and their enemies. In the school I went to in the 67, yeah, I mean, we have Red Guards form different groups, fighting each other, all want to be the top dog. And the most famous one is Tsinghua University. My uncle wrote the 100-Day War. And Tsinghua University is a very telling example. Pai Dafu, this guy was a Tsinghua, very smart student. He was enrolled in the nuclear physics department. And it came from poor peasants. And by his own exam scores, and he got into Tsinghua, the top university in China, in May and June of 66. Beginning of the Cultural Revolution, Liu Shaoqi's wife was part of the work team that went to Tsinghua, and Kuai Dafu, the guy, have some mild criticism of the work team. The work team responds, it says, "You are attacking the party." Oh my God. And Kuai Dafu just doesn't buy it and just fight against the work team. And he was so bold. One person argued against 10,000 people in a big auditorium, a big exercise ground, and people one after another came to the stage, argued with him. He just one person fought off all the people. So brave. And then Liu Shaoqi's wife decided that, well, actually, Liu Shaoqi gave his wife, says that capitalism doesn't give us democracy. We don't give capitalist democracy. So they put Kuai Dafu under house arrest. So Kuai Dafu just engaged in a hunger strike. After a few days, they have to let him out because he's going on a hunger strike. In July, Mao came back to Beijing. Joe and I went to Tsinghua, talked to Kuai Dafu, and for 2 days, gathered all kinds of details. The crime Liu Shaoqi did to the student movement. And that's what made the Liu Shaoqi came down. Just like Kuai Dafu, single-handedly almost. How you handle the students who criticize you. So then Kuai Dafu became the leader of Tsinghua University rebel group. But by the spring, a lot of people in the rebel group not happy with Kuai Dafu, and they find he's too arrogant, like he's the top, he's the best and everything. So they split. They split two factions. They start arguing. And then these two factions occupy two buildings, two different buildings. They have big character posters arguing, criticizing each other, denouncing each other. They set up loudspeakers on top of the rooftop, blasting, criticizing each other. And then they explore to kidnap people from the other side, put them in the basement. And that's not enough. They get so angry. Tsinghua University is science and technology university. People know how to make weapons. So they make homemade rockets fighting each other. So by summer of 68, Mao says, enough is enough. We cannot keep this thing keep going. So Mao mobilized, ordered tens of thousands of workers around Beijing. They all marched with no arms into the Tsinghua University, dismantled these factional fighting apparatus. In that scuffle, few workers got killed. You can see these arguments started with genuine criticism of people in leadership who don't treat the workers, students, intellectuals, or office workers as equals. But then once you finish the criticism, how do you run the place? Factionalism dominates. That's the lessons for working class revolution anywhere to learn. So the Cultural Revolution is about how to prevent revolutionaries become the new oppressors. That issue is universal in class society, universal.
It's interesting you mentioned Kuai Dafu because right before this call, Space and I were talking about the dialogue that Mao and others had with him and other Red Guard leaders in July of 1968. And even at that point, even after they'd been disarmed, some of the Red Guard leaders were so factional, they were begging Mao to let them use the PLA to fight against the other factions. Like, help us, help us. And Mao and others were trying to just say, like, you totally misunderstood the basic political situation. And of course, actually, as your uncle's book shows, 100-Day War, most of the students were able to be won over and realize the mistakes they had made. But there was a few, I think he calls them the iron rods, people like Kuai who just never admit that they had made mistakes, diehard factionalists. It's a complicated question how to really overcome this, but certainly a central question the Cultural Revolution poses for us.
Right. Well, same thing in the US, the labor movement and the communist movement, same thing. So you have to distinguish the differences within the labor movement, within the working class, or within the communists. People claim to see themselves as communists. We have different ideas, debates, arguments, and you got to understand only through debate arguments to realize what is the real differences. Are we trying to be the top dog? Are we trying to fight for pecking orders? Or are we trying to find solidarity? solidarity, people talk, but how to achieve solidarity? If you don't know how to distinguish between different aims versus different means, you don't know how to distinguish between contradictions within the people or the contradiction between people and their enemies. So the unity came from struggle, but it's very important. The aim, the purpose of the struggle is not to knock somebody down, but rather clarify the ideological differences, the difference in line in terms of approach, or differences in aim. Quite often, people might not be too clear. Even anybody advocating any lines, they might not be clear what their line leads to ultimately. Some people are diehard. I mean, they will not admit their line actually is not just a line struggle about means, it's about struggle about aims, because the ideology eventually leads them to there. So that's the thing about revisionism, reformism, all that stuff. That's how I see the value of cultural revolution for the rest of the world to learn, is to know how to distinguish between different aims versus different means.